Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, some more Simpsons, another Mickey Mouse game, and another obscure sci-fi game for the NES. Hi, I'm your host Jared, and today is March 3rd, 1993. Capitalize on things while they're hot. Released this week for the Sega Genesis was The Simpsons, Bart's Nightmare. Bart's Nightmare is a half-and-half game. Bart falls asleep while working on homework, and half the game is in his dream world trying to recollect homework pages. The other half is different mini-games he must complete to get said pages. These mini-games include a shoot-'em-up as Bartman, wreaking havoc as Bartzilla, and a parody of Indiana Jones. Get as many pages as possible to raise Bart's letter grade and avoid the shame of the rest of the Simpsons family. Bart's Nightmare for the Sega Genesis is a port of the game which was already released for the Super Nintendo a few months prior. Nothing was really changed gameplay-wise, which means it's still just as frustrating, difficult, and has incredibly slippery controls in every mode. Bart's Nightmare continues the deluge of Simpsons products that permeated all throughout 1992, leaking into 1993. There were multiple Simpsons games released in the previous year, and the Sega port of Bart's Nightmare opens the floodgate of Simpsons games for the remainder of the year. And I hate this game. The difficulty is no joke, and I could stomach only some of the mini-games, namely the Bartman one. The controls are awful, it's not really fun, and the stages drag on for way too long to give the player any kind of chance. It's a hodgepodge mess that would have gotten lambasted if it wasn't for the brand recognition. As it turns out, it was also terrible to make. It was programmed by veteran game designer Bill Williams, who cut his teeth making games like Necromancer and Alley Cat for the Atari 2600 and Pioneer Plague for the Amiga. He disaffectionately called Bart's Nightmare as Bill's Nightmare because he hated working on it so much because of corporate influence. He didn't specify if the unwanted influence was from the publisher Acclaim or even Fox Studios, who owned the Simpsons license at the time. Either way, it was so bad, Bill Williams quit the gaming industry completely in the middle of development, which is why in the game's credits, he's listed under miscellaneous. Still, somehow, the SNES version came out to fairly positive reviews. Reviewers must have wisened up at least a little bit because the Genesis port fared far worse. Some review outlets gave the Sega version as low as a 30%. And GamePro magazine went from high remarks for the Super Nintendo game to calling the Sega port, which is pretty much the same, for having poor controls, no continues, and calling it only semi-fun. The future owners of The Simpsons also had a game out this week in 1993 called World of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, for the Sega Genesis. World of Illusion is a direct sequel to Castle of Illusion, released for the Sega in 1990. It keeps the same style of platforming gameplay, with the biggest change being the inclusion of Donald Duck as a selectable character. It also makes it two-player, while you play cooperatively and even help each other out by doing things like throwing down ropes to help with tricky jumps. Aside from that, keep moving to the right to reach the end of the stage and use your magical cape to defeat enemies. There are even some stages that can only be accessed by a solo Mickey, a solo Donald, or the both present together. World of Illusion is another Disney game made for the Genesis, developed internally by Sega. It was made by Sega's dev team, AM7, the same team who made tons of fantastic Sega games. This includes titles like Streets of Rage, Phantasy Star, and later on, Magic Knight Rayearth. Their polish really shines in World of Illusion, with good music, smooth animation, and even a little bit of voice samples for both Mickey and Donald. Magazine reviews suggested the same. GamePro magazine reviewed it with an almost perfect score. There would be more Illusion games, including Land of Illusion for the Sega Master System and the Game Gear later this year, and then one more in 1995 with Legend of Illusion for the Sega Game Gear. The NES was still getting new releases. Released around this time in 1993, was Zen Intergalactic Ninja. Zen Intergalactic Ninja is an action platformer with both an isometric view and a side-scrolling view, where you got to play as one of the coolest things ever in the early 90s, a ninja. Run, jump, and use your bow staff to take down enemies. There would also be fast-paced minecart stages, which could impressively swap to a side-scrolling 2D view and back again. It also has a stage select allowing you to proceed in any order, some of those in isometric view, some in classic 2D view, plenty of boss fights, and some bonus stages changes therein. Zen is actually a licensed game. The Intergalactic Ninja was a comic book hero from Archie Comics beginning in 1987. In the comic, Zen was a genetic experiment baby shot into space and landed on a strange planet to be trained in martial arts and become a mercenary. In the video game, Zen is an eco-warrior. Following the early 90s messaging of programming directed toward children, environmental awareness was its main goal, much akin to Captain Planet. It's why the game's plot involves Zen battling the polluting, hazardous, dastardly Lord Contaminus. It's also why the stages are things like Toxic Factory and Acidic Forest. It's also why the bonus game's goal is to have Zen recycle as many items as possible. Zen Intergalactic Ninja was developed and published by Konami, and the prowess with the NES really shows here. It has some impressive sprite work, lots of action, and that familiar sounding Konami music. Not only that, around this same time, Konami also released a Game Boy version of Zen Intergalactic Ninja. It's more simplistic, of course, being a slower paced, straight up 2D side-scroller, but you can charge an attack to shoot projectiles. Both would get a fair amount of coverage leading up to its release, suggesting that Konami did want Zen to be something of a thing. Nintendo Power did previews of both the NES and the Game Boy versions, one in issue 45 and the other in issue 48. It also reviewed fairly well, with Nintendo Power giving it an average of a 3.3 out of 5 and GamePro magazine being positive per usual. Despite the marketing push, despite the comic line, despite the toy line, and despite the video game teasing a sequel during its ending, Zen Intergalactic Ninja never took off. A handful of extra comics were made around 2010, but no other video game ever came to be. As for everything else, here's Editor Dylan.
Tumble Pop for the Game Boy has you sucking things up and shooting them back at other enemies. You know, like Kirby's Dream Land, or Yoshi's Island, or Luigi's Mansion, or Blink's the Time Sweeper. Caesar's Palace released for the Game Gear and Genesis, and nothing changed since the last two times I covered it. You gamble at a casino in Vegas. Woohoo. Super Strike Eagle is another flight combat sim for the SNES. What sets it apart from the rest is the way it offers variety. The takeoff and landing sequences are in third person, then switch to a top-down perspective when peppering ground targets with gunfire. But when engaging in flight combat, it switches to a first-person mode. It's kinda cool, and definitely worth the asking price. If I'm not mistaken, we haven't covered a single beat-em-up this year. Well, the Combat Tribes breaks that 2-month-long streak on the Super Nintendo. The cool thing about it is the unlockable versus mode, where you could try out some of the enemy's different movesets. Unfortunately, it doesn't offer anything new as you take on generic street punks in New York City. The big American city setting is already oversaturated in the genre, so it really doesn't stand out at all. While there are technically cyborgs in the game, they all still look and fight like humans, so why bother? Another beat-em-up released this week was Mazin Saga Mutant Fighter for the Genesis. Some people would call it a hack and slash, which is just a beat-em-up, but you use a weapon more often. Mazin Saga takes place in a post-apocalyptic 1999 as you fight monster demon things with souped-up armor. It kinda reminds me of Guyver. Anyone? No? Well, worth a shot. And it turns out I'm not far off. It's based off the manga Majinga Z by Go Nagai, who also made Devilman, really? Hell yeah. And is arguably the creator of the entire ecchi genre. No, I will not elaborate. It's a much more interesting beat-em-up than Combat Tribes, but how are the boss battles? Well, they're in a completely different genre. It becomes a full-blown fighting game, health bars and all. Different controls, different sprites, and different game. This was such a cool twist that it's a shame the controls don't hold up as well as the previous sections. Also, I suck at fighting games, so that could have had something to do with it. At this point, I'm sick of beat-em ups already, so hopefully that's enough while something... Oops, pause for a second. Battletoads released on the Genesis this week and offers the entirety of the NES original, but with a few minor adjustments. The visuals and music got slightly better, and the difficulty is slightly less bullshit. Honestly, most beat-em-ups are overly difficult, but Battletoads is one of those games where I do not feel bad at all for using save states. I mean, do I even need to bring up the hoverbike section? No, I do not. That leaves us with a total of 11 games released on these 5 consoles this week in 1999. 1993. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Dylan. Bart's Nightmare has not fared well over the years. It released with an MSRP of $49.95, and now the game alone is less than $30. And a complete one is barely over $45. World of Illusion's value hasn't been great either, despite it being a great game. A copy of that game is worth about $20. And if you get a complete one, it's worth just under $30. Zen Intergalactic Ninja, on the other hand, is this week's biggest value gainer. The game alone is worth about $150, and a complete copy with the box and manual is a staggering $600. Even the Game Boy version is worth $30 and $275 respectively. And that's it for today. Next week, a puzzle sequel, a good licensed game, and I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. I want to thank some patrons like Tom Perslin, Sprinkles the Husky, and Rushmore Miles. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching this show every single Friday. What was it about Simpsons games where as a kid I kept renting them even though I knew they were bad? I rented Bart's Nightmare so many times thinking I could get to the end of just one of those mini games. Between that and Virtual Bart, I wasted a lot of weekends as a kid.